At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, a B-17G Flying Fortress shook violently at 30,000 feet above Budapest, Hungary. Black flak bursts climbed through the thin summer air, each explosion snapping closer, each shock rattling aluminum skin and frozen plexiglass. In the left seat sat First Lieutenant Evald Swanson, 24 years old, lean, steady, flying his 18th combat mission as aircraft commander. Below him lay the railway yards and oil facilities, feeding the Eastern Front, defended by hundreds of German 88mm guns, arranged in dense rings around the city. Swanson's bomber Mispa flew in a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, part of the 15th Air Force, striking north from Italy. By July 1944, every man in that formation knew the numbers out of 10 airmen who climbed aboard a heavy bomber 8 would not return home. The formation pressed on as flak tore through the sky, shredding metal, punching holes through wings and fuselages, turning altitude into a killing field. Seconds after bomb release, with 2 tons gone and the aircraft surging upward, an 88mm shell detonated directly in front of the cockpit. The entire nose of the aircraft vanished. The bombardier's station, the navigator's compartment, the instruments, the control column, and the forward structure simply ceased to exist, replaced by screaming wind and open sky. Cold air 40 degrees below zero poured through the gap, ripping at flight suits and tearing sound into a constant roar. Swanson stared forward and saw nothing where the cockpit should have been. No gauges, no yoke, no protection. Yet the aircraft did not fall. Bare steel control cables, whipped in the slipstream, still connected, still alive, hanging where hands had never been meant to reach them. Somehow, the bomber stayed airborne, and the next 10 minutes would decide who lived. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new brutal phase in the air. From long, sun-baked runways in southern Italy, the 15th Air Force pushed north every day, sending heavy bombers deeper into Axis-controlled territory than ever before. These missions stretched from the Po Valley to the Balkans, across mountains, rivers, and cities, ringed with anti-aircraft guns, built precisely for this moment. Budapest was one of those cities. Sitting astride the Danube, it functioned as a critical rail and fuel hub, linking German industry to armies fighting desperately on the Eastern Front. Coal, oil, ammunition, replacement tanks, and entire divisions moved through its yards and refineries, making the city a strategic artery the Allies could not ignore. On maps in Italian briefing rooms, Budapest was marked with thick circles and warning notes. The defenses were among the densest in Central Europe. German planners had surrounded the city with hundreds of 88mm flak guns, layered by altitude, calibrated to shred heavy bombers, flying at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. Each gun crew worked from pre-measured firing tables, turning the sky itself into a grid of timed explosions. For a B-17 crew, survival here depended on formation discipline. Tight boxes allowed overlapping defensive fire, shared navigation, and mutual protection against fighters. Break formation and a bomber became a lone target exposed to flak and roaming Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, waiting for stragglers. There was no escort over Budapest. The distance was too great. Fighter cover turned back far to the south, leaving the bombers to face the defenses alone. Inside each aircraft, the men knew the stakes. They memorized emergency procedures, bailout routes, and prison camp rumors because they understood the odds. Some carried maps sewn into jackets. Others carried nothing but the hope that this mission would not be the one that ended everything. The plan for July 14th was straightforward. Approach from the south, maintain altitude bomb through the flak, regroup over the rally point, and turn southwest toward the Adriatic and home. Nothing about it was simple in practice. Every minute over the target increased the chance that one shell would find the right angle, the right timing, the right piece of aluminum. For the crews of the 483rd Bomb Group, this was another line on a growing list of missions. For one aircraft over Budapest, it was about to become a test no engineer had planned for, and no training manual could explain. Evald Swanson did not look like the kind of man history usually notices. At 24, he was young, even by wartime standards, lean, rather than imposing, quiet in a cockpit crowded with louder personalities and heavier reputations. He had not been a test pilot or a famous ace, just one aircraft commander among hundreds flying out of southern Italy in the summer of 1944. But by the time Mispa crossed the Hungarian border, Swanson had already learned what the job truly required. 17 combat missions had taught him that a B-17 was not flown by one man alone. It was a system. Pilot and co-pilot up front, bombardier and navigator in the nose flight engineer, watching engines and fuel gunners spread through metal compartments no wider than a hallway. Each man owned a piece of survival. On paper, Swanson's responsibility was simple. Hold formation, follow headings, keep airspeed steady, bring the aircraft home if possible. What the paperwork never captured was the weight of command when something went wrong. If an engine failed, he decided whether to stay or turn back. If flak hit a wing, he decided whether to drop out or press on. If men were lost, he carried that knowledge alone. Inside Mispa, the crew trusted him with more than the aircraft. They trusted him with timing, judgment, and the understanding that hesitation could be fatal. Swanson believed in procedure, but he believed more deeply in people. He knew machines failed. He knew checklists ended. What mattered when the margins disappeared was whether a crew could think together without being told how. That belief had never been tested like this. In seconds, the bombardier and navigator were gone. The cockpit no longer existed as a place of control. What remained was a pilot responsible for 10 lives, flying an aircraft no one had ever trained to fly. And every decision he made next would demand a price he had not yet calculated. Chain of mini-scenes. Mini-scene 1, the instant after the hit. For a fraction of a second after the explosion, the aircraft felt weightless. The center of gravity shifted violently backward as the nose disappeared, and Mispa pitched up into a near-vertical climb. Loose objects slammed against the rear bulkheads while the engines clawed for air, their steady roar turning uneven as the bomber approached a stall. Swanson pushed forward by instinct. There was nothing there. Where the control column should have been was only empty air and torn metal, with blue sky visible through a jagged opening. If the nose rose any higher, the aircraft would fall out of the sky. Mini-scene 2, stabilizing the impossible. Somehow the B-17 leveled out. No procedure explained it. The aircraft's inherent stability built into its wings and tail fought the sudden imbalance just long enough to save it. Cold air rushed through the open cavity at nearly 300 miles per hour, freezing exposed skin and turning the cockpit into a wind tunnel. Swanson locked his eyes on the horizon and adjusted engine power by listening to changes in vibration, rather than watching instruments that no longer existed. The bomber stayed airborne. For now. Mini-scene 3, the second blow. At 9:44 a.m., another 88mm shell found its mark. Engine number 2 on the left wing exploded in a spray of oil and metal flames streaming backward along the nacelle. The propeller windmilled briefly, then ceased. Mispa was down to 3 engines. The formation ahead continued on course, maintaining speed and altitude, unable to slow without risking the entire group. The gap began to open. Mini-scene 4, discovering the cables. Behind the cockpit, Technical Sergeant Frank Gamenzi forced his way forward through the fuselage. What he saw stopped him cold. The flight control cables were still intact. Bundles of steel wire rope, each roughly 3/8 of an inch thick, ran exposed through the aircraft, whipping and vibrating in the slipstream. Normally hidden behind panels and pulleys, they were now bare, unrestrained, alive. If no one held them, the bomber would become uncontrollable. Someone had to become the control system. Mini-scene 5, hands replace machinery. Staff Sergeant George Simelli and Staff Sergeant Robert Bell moved forward without waiting for orders. They positioned themselves near the bomb bay where the main cable runs converged. There was no intercom. The noise made speech useless anyway. They wrapped gloved hands around freezing steel-feeling vibration and tension instead of gauges and indicators. When they pulled left, the nose moved left. When they pulled back, the nose rose. It worked, but only barely. Mini-scene 6, flying by coordination. Swanson adjusted engine power in small increments. Each change demanded an immediate response from the men on the cables. Throttle up on engine number 4 meant compensating rudder. Throttle back on engine number 1 meant easing elevator tension. Too much pull and the aircraft overreacted. Too little and nothing happened. 10 men became one system reacting by instinct and timing alone. One mistake would end everything. Mini Scene 7 falling behind. The missing nose created enormous drag. The destroyed engine robbed the aircraft of speed. Mispa slipped backward through the sky as the rest of the formation pulled away toward the Adriatic. First, the lead aircraft grew smaller. Then the entire group compressed into a distant cluster. Standard procedure was unforgiving. Bombers that could not hold formation were left behind. By 9:46 a.m., Mispa was alone. Mini Scene 8, the tail begins to fail. In the isolated tail compartment, Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker felt something deeply wrong. The structure behind him flexed under aerodynamic load metal, shifting where it should have been rigid. Stress fractures spread invisibly through the fuselage. If the tail failed, the bomber would enter an unrecoverable spin. There would be no bailout, no warning, just sudden silence. The countdown had begun. Mini Scene 9, choosing to abandon the aircraft. Altitude slipped from 30,000 feet to 28,000, then lower. Fuel quantity was unknown. The gauges were gone with the nose. Swanson knew what the numbers meant, even without instruments. They were losing the fight against physics. He made the only rational decision left: get the crew out while control still existed. But there was no way to give the order. So the crew decided for themselves. Mini Scene 10, one by one. The first man clipped his parachute and jumped through the waist window. Then another. Each departure reduced the number of hands on the cables. The bomber began to wallow, wings dipping, nose hunting for balance. Swanson compensated with throttles alone, knowing it was not enough. Still, men kept jumping. They had to. Staying meant dying when the tail finally failed. And the aircraft was running out of time. At 9:56 a.m., Mispa passed through 22,000 feet and kept descending. The bomber was no longer truly being flown. It was being held together by residual lift, uneven thrust, and seconds of delayed reaction. Most of the crew was gone, now falling under parachutes somewhere below the broken aircraft. Only a few hands had been pulling the cables. Now there were almost none. The control runs hung slack through the bomb bay, steel lines snapping in the wind without guidance. Up front, Swanson felt the aircraft begin to drift. A slight roll to the left, a slow, dangerous pitch upward. He corrected the only way he still could: throttle. He reduced power on engine number 1, increased power on engine number 4. The response was sluggish but real. The wings steadied, barely. Behind him, Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt remained in the co-pilot seat. He had no controls, no instruments, nothing to contribute except presence and watchfulness. They exchanged a look. No words were needed. If Burnt stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally failed. If he left now, he might live. Burnt unbuckled, moved aft with careful steps, and disappeared toward the waist section. Moments later, he was gone. Swanson was alone. One man in a 65,000-pound bomber at roughly 20,000 feet. 3 engines still running. Fuel unknown. Tail structure flexing with every vibration. The aircraft was descending at about 200 feet per minute, not diving, but steadily losing the argument with gravity. Swanson calculated in his head. Distance flown. Time elapsed. Wind direction. Rough position over Yugoslavia. Every estimate was uncertain. But one thing was clear. If he stayed aboard longer, the men below would gain more separation. German patrols would search for the crash. Distance mattered. Minutes mattered. He stayed. Hands locked on the throttles. Eyes fixed on the horizon. At 9:58 a.m., the bomber dipped through 18,000 feet. The tail shuddered again. Harder this time. That was the line. Swanson waited 2 more minutes. Then he released the throttles. The moment he unbuckled, the wind tried to pull him forward toward the open sky where the nose used to be. The aircraft rolled gently left. Then more. Mispa was beginning its final descent. Swanson moved fast. He forced his way through the narrow crawlway into the bomb bay, the floor vibrating under his boots. The control cables swung freely now. No one held them. The bomber was accelerating. He reached the waist gun opening clipped on his parachute and did not hesitate. He jumped. Moments after Swanson cleared the aircraft, Mispa continued alone. 3 engines still roared as the bomber dropped through the thin air, its profile broken, its balance gone. At roughly 15,000 feet, the strain finally exceeded what the airframe could bear. The tail section failed. Metal tore away from metal, and the rear fuselage separated cleanly, ending any remaining stability. The forward section pitched nose down and entered a steep, accelerating dive. 8 seconds later, the B-17 struck the Yugoslav forest roughly 2 miles away. The fuel ignited on impact. Nothing survived the crash. Above the wreckage, parachutes drifted down across fields, trees, and small villages. 8 crewmen landed alive. Some hit open ground. Others came down hard in trees or rough terrain. Within hours, German occupation forces began collecting them one by one. All 8 surviving crew members were captured that day. Swanson's own descent ended violently in the branches of a tree, his left leg breaking on impact and deep cuts tearing through his flight suit. German soldiers reached him within minutes, cut him free, and summoned a medic. A temporary splint was applied in the field before he was transported to a military medical facility. The fracture was set. The leg would heal. The war for him and his crew was over. In total, 2 men from Mispa were killed in action when the nose was destroyed. 8 survived by parachute. All 8 would spend the remainder of the war as prisoners. They were sent to Stalag Luft camps designated for captured Allied aircrew facilities holding thousands of American and British officers. Conditions were harsh but regulated. Food was scarce. Medical care was basic. Winter was unforgiving. But they lived, and the mission itself had been completed. The bombs fell on target. The rail yards burned. The supply lines feeding the Eastern Front were disrupted, if only briefly. 1 bomber was lost. 10 men were not. In official records, the loss of Mispa was 1 line among thousands. 1 B-17 destroyed. 2 men killed in action. 8 airmen captured. But paperwork could never explain what actually happened in the sky over Budapest. No manual described flying without a nose. No checklist accounted for bare control cables pulled by frozen hands. No engineer designed a bomber to be steered by human grip alone. That was the part history almost lost. After the war, Evald Swanson returned home to Michigan. He married, raised a family, worked, and lived quietly for decades. When people asked about the war, he rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. He said only that he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, that 2 young men, Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson, had not been lucky at all. The Army Air Forces recognized Swanson's service over time, promoting him through the ranks until he eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel. The recognition was not tied to headlines or ceremonies. It reflected a career defined by responsibility, discipline, and restraint rather than self-promotion. The crew of Mispa stayed in touch. They met at reunions. They talked about the 10 minutes without a cockpit, about the sound of wind tearing through empty space, about pulling steel cables while a bomber tried to come apart around them. They talked about the men who did not make it home. And they remembered. Evald Swanson passed away in 2009 at the age of 89. By then, aviation had changed beyond anything his generation could have imagined. Jets crossed oceans in hours. Satellites circled the Earth. Flight had become safe, precise, and automated. But the story of Mispa remains a reminder of what flight once demanded from human beings. Not perfection, not hero speeches, just cooperation under pressure and the refusal to quit when systems failed. If you are watching this today, this story is not only about a bomber crew in 1944. It is about people who carried unbearable responsibility and rarely spoke about it afterward. Someone like that may exist in your own family. Ask them, listen, and remember, if this story mattered to you, please hit like, so YouTube will show it to more people who have never heard this name. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more true stories about ordinary people forced to make extraordinary decisions. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and whether someone in your family served. Because these stories only survive if we carry them forward.